Welcome, everyone. It is 10 o'clock on the West Coast. I believe that's noon here in Central Time Zone for Daryl. So I have a webinar for you that is going to be very, very interesting, especially if you come from the developer side. But for anyone that's kind of getting into Power Apps, especially using Canvas and Model, you certainly need to know how to manage the low code portion of complex Canvas apps. So that's what we'll be talking about. Daryl, welcome to the webinars. How you doing?
Doing good, Pervin. It's good to be on.
So this one is certainly going to be a very interesting one. As soon as you posted this to me that you wanted to do it, I immediately kind of circled it and said we need to make sure that we get the word out, because the way that I kind of always describe it is code bloat. A lot of people, when they first start off with building an app, they're kind of indiscriminate as to how they're building it, and then they'll discover, well, if I was a little bit more predictive on how I built this, I could have done a lot more efficiencies. Is that pretty much what you were thinking when you submitted this to us?
Yeah, that's pretty much the same approach. I think of someone writing a book, they don't sit down and write the book perfectly. They have lots and lots and lots of revisions, and for some reason people try to hold themselves to a higher standard of I'm going to write it the first time and it's going to be right, and they don't think of having to revise what they wrote. So yeah. Yep.
Totally hear you. So let's just go straight into this. I'm sure that the audience will certainly appreciate it. And for those of you who are here live, if you have questions, please go ahead and submit it in the Q&A panel, and we will certainly take time to answer as much as we can. So with that said, Daryl, let's kick this off.
All right, thank you. Hopefully you can see my how to manage low code screen currently.
Absolutely.
All right, awesome. Let's go ahead and get started here. So a little bit about myself. I started my own company in February. I'm a 4-year MVP, developer at heart. So I would be the non-citizen developer. I'd be the pro developer, I guess, if people have drawn such lines. I do a lot of work in the XRM toolbox. I'm a contributor to that. I have multiple plugins for that. List those there in my little screenshot here. I also do a lot of unit testing with what formerly CRM, but now CDS, just the core CDS Power App platform. I also have my own podcast, XRM Toolcast, and I help on the XRM virtual online user group as well. And I am from Fishers, Indiana, which is on the Eastern time zone, so it's 1 p.m. for me rather than noon, but that's okay. Perfectly good time to be able to hopefully share what I've learned and go from here. So when Pervin asked me about this is really coming from me stepping into a new role of my current client. I've been doing CDS, dynamic CRM type of coding work for over a decade, and now they're saying, hey, we have this new app that we've been doing, this Canvas app, this Power app that we've been working on, that is needing to get over the goal line. And they've been having a citizen developer working on it for the last six plus months, and it's probably there's over 5,000 lines worth of code, at least when I started on it, that were in it in this actual low code app, and all these different controls and all these different places. So it was a huge learning experience for me to do that. So hopefully, from my experience with doing that, I'm going to try to share that with you, the audience, and hopefully you could take a nugget or two away from that. And if you can't, then you'll get all of your money back. So I can't show the actual app I've been working on, so I decided to take an open source app that exists out there, and it's the PowerType app by fellow MVP Scott Durow. You can download it from his GitHub site. I'll get the link there. And I'll step back and say this is a very clean app. Scott is a pro developer as well, so I would expect him to have a high level of attention to decent code organization and things being well written and defined and created. And he has done that, so that's great. So there wasn't a whole lot of, hey, this is bad stuff, you need to remove examples, but I did try to go through and just give some examples of things that will actually be helpful for you and in your app that you're working on. So first, let's do a quick little playthrough of what this app is. This is an actual game that he created, and it's called PowerType. I'm just going to go ahead and run it here. And so in this game, if you ever did Mavis Beacon stuff back in the day, basically you start seeing some words, you start typing the words, and the words should float in. Not sure how well you will see it on the team site with the lag, but that's basically what's going to happen there. type in words, they fill out, and you can erase all those words and keep on going and get your typing skills up to snuff. So that's the app in a nutshell. So this is the app that we're going to be taking a look in and diving into today. I've added some extra screens here as well. So by default, just these 2 screens, I've added my own down here as well. And we'll dive into those as well. But let's take a look at the first thing I want to show off. First thing I want to say, and this is actually the biggest thing as well. So if you are dealing with a large Canvas app, you're going to be dealing with a lot of issues that are revolved around having a low-code tool that has lots of code in it, but not the tools to maintain that, if that makes sense. For pro devs, we've got 30, 40 years of development behind us, history behind us, of people using tools to create better tools and being able to have a better way of handling and managing all their code base. And in this low-code Canvas app world, those don't necessarily apply as easily as you would like. So the first tool that I created to help ease some of that burden and to hopefully help to be able to leverage some of the tools that exist for regular code, not just this Power Apps formulas, is the Canvas App Packager. If you are a user of CRM or CDS or Dynamics for customer engagement or whatever you want to, actually there's no for, is it? It's just Dynamics customer engagement. If you are using one of those, that platform, you may be familiar with the Solution Packager. And the Solution Packager takes your export from your environment and it gets exported as a single zip file, and it will go through and spit all that out into all these individual files, and it's much easier to see what changes have actually been made and to narrow down what is actually in this version versus the previous version of your export. So that's basically exactly what I tended to do with this Canvas App Packager. You can get it on GitHub, the link here, and it's just basically you take that zip file and you run it through the Canvas App Packager, and it splits it out into lots of different files. So let's walk through that real quick now. So in order to export an app, we're going to go to the actual make.powerapps.com. I'm going to select this thing. I'm going to say export the package and go through the steps here. So this is the power type. Export. Now, if you had flows and other things in here, they'd be showing up here as well. But currently, that's the only thing since this app doesn't connect to anything else, so it's fairly simple in that sense. So, and rather than waiting that go through, I've actually already downloaded an earlier version, so I'll just go look at that one. So let's go to my downloads folder here, and actually go pull up in my command line. So this is the actual path I have to my exe that I've downloaded, the Canvas App Packager exe. It takes an action, so it's either unpack or pack, and then it takes the actual file here, or the folder you want to unpack to. So that's temp ms canvas app demo extract, and then the name of the zip file. I'm going to bring that over from my downloads folder. Just got done downloading. Push enter, and it's going to run through and extract everything out. And it's going to extract it out by folder, by screen. By screen, it will extract into a folder. And then each control is going to be a separate file in there. Actually, it's going to be 2 files. There's going to be a JSON file, which is some of the metadata for it. And then there's going to be a JSON file, which contains all the actual formulas that you can use some part of low code in. So that's how the whole structure of it works. So if I go look at what's spit out here, we have these apps in here. Here's the actual power type that we just grabbed. And then in here is the actual code. Everything else in here is all this metadata that's required for your app. But in here we have the actual code, and in here is basically where you're going to get all your value of what's being used, what's not being used. So you have anything that's app level. This app is there's hardly anything at all in the actual onload of the app. So if we open that JavaScript file up, we'll see there's the confirm exit on start and then the size break. Those are the different app level functions you can actually call. So you can see there's nothing in the actual on start for this app. So, but that's just and then back up a little bit. There's a JSON file as well. JSON file is just metadata. I never touch this stuff. Every now and then it changes depending if there's maybe a new version of Canvas apps. But that's the JavaScript formulas, or actually the formulas for the power formulas, were actually pulled out of this file. So that's why there's a .json and a .js for that. So that's pulling that all out, and then you could take that and then you can check that all into your source control repository, either GitHub or TFS, and then you have a backup in it that you can actually look at and be able to see kind of what's going on. So the real question we have of why would we do that, so it's the why, and the number one reason there right off the bat is to check in code. So if you're not an actual pro developer, why is checking in code helpful? What is it actually doing? Well, the first thing it's going to give you is it's going to give you the ability to compare differences. So let's give a quick little example here. If I am working on something and I go, okay, this power type, if we go look at the actual formula for it, we'll see that it's the parent width minus the label width divided by 2 to be perfectly centered here. Now, if for some reason you accidentally double click on it to type on it, and you rather than double clicking on it, you move it ever so slightly, now you've lost your formula. Your X value's gone away. So that's kind of hurtful of, hey, what was that value? Now, luckily, you can control Z and undo that. But let's say, for example, that you've changed it, you've gone to some other screen, you published, you didn't know that you changed it. And then you've gone and you published it, now you got an issue. What was that value before? I've lost my control Z, I can't undo. How do I know what that value was? Or how did I even know that I changed that value? In the last month, I've probably removed the formula for positioning probably 6 or 7 times, and I caught it when I was looking at my code diff. So something you can't do without having the code actually checked into somewhere and seeing your differences. So let's take a little WinMerge here. WinMerge is just an open source tool for comparing things. If you're checking stuff into Azure DevOps, you'd probably use just Visual Studio, whatever tool you have for comparing that. But I've got 2 different extracts I've done. So I've extracted a version 1, I've extracted a version 2, and now I'm using this WinMerge to compare these files locally. So if I go through, we'll see we have our app folder we saw before, but we also have this screen splash. Notice that there is a difference here. If you look at the title, we can actually look at the title JavaScript, and we can open it up and see that it was 40, or it used to be this formula. So now I can go, oh, great, I know what the formula is. I can go back into my app. I can find it by the actual name of the actual screen and then the name of the control, label title. So we see that we are in the label title file here. And paste my value, and boom, now I've undone stuff without having to undo the entire app. So in Power Apps and Canvas apps, you do have the ability to have version controls as far as you can go back a version and go forward a version. But in a realistic scenario, usually you change 15 things and you don't really want to go back just to fix the one. And so it's kind of painful to do that. So this is a way, a methodology for you to do that without having to roll back your app and roll it forward again and getting that change. So simple example there. Another example is finding the variable usage. So let's take a look at this image player that we have here. Image player 1 is this little spacecraft that Scott created here, which is a nice little spacecraft. And let's say we want to know, how does this thing move around? Well, it's using this player1x variable. Cool. So where's this player1x variable being set? Where is it being used? If I have a bug in it, it's not operating correctly, where could that bug actually be happening? You do have a nice view action here to go to your actual variables and go find this thing. So the name was as a player1x, yeah, player1x. So this isn't entirely helpful. You can't just look at this, see what's going on, because it's a very, very large function here. And if I open it, sometimes you get lucky and it takes you to the actual area. Sometimes it doesn't. And because this is all HTML, your browser sort of search functionality doesn't search what's invisible, only searches what's visible. So you can't find it very easily. So that's a real pain point. So how does having the app extracted help you in that? Well, if you use a tool like VS Code, which I highly recommend for this, free tool from Microsoft. And basically, you just go and open the actual folder and select the folder that you extracted everything out at. So that's a code folder here. Actually, go to the main app code. Cool. So once that loads, there's a little search function here. And you can say, hey, I want to find where that player 1x is. Player 1, is it player 1x? Let's go back. What did I search for? Image player 1, player 1x, yep. All right, it's player 1x, and search. Now it gives you every single place that it's used in your app. So very first part, this is the part we looked at the screen earlier. It's the X value for the image player 1 control. Okay. So that's one we've already looked at, so that's good. So what's this other place here? Well, it's also used in the image warp engine. So this is going to be the, look back at the app, close this. That's the little tail here. It's actually a different icon because it has to go through and change the way it looks. So it looks like it's pulsating when you're playing it. It's used in the X value of this one as well. Okay, so that's the second spot it's used. And you can see the formula there. Then finally, it's used in this game loop. Now, if you're doing a business app, you're never going to have a game loop that goes through and handles moving all your objects every second or whatever it is that Scott set up for this to work. But you may have a main part of your app that does a lot of the logic. So this is helpful too to see where it's set. So it's being set here. It's being used to set the target X app here. And I wonder if I can zoom in a little bit. Nope, don't know the zoom control view, zoom. All right, well, I guess you're gonna have to zoom in on your computers later. So that's set there. And then it's also being used here in this equation here, which is trying to figure out if you've gone outside the boundary and you've actually hit something. And then another set here where it's actually moving it to the new position. And that's it. Those are the only places that it's being used at. So without having the code locally on your machine and being able to search for stuff, it's very, very difficult to figure out all the places that a certain variable is being set, used, or modified, even though there are some tools in the app for it. But the more complicated the app is, the worse the tools in the app perform, and the better it is to have local stuff that you've extracted out. So although the Canvas App Packager is set up to actually pack things as well, so if I wanted to go in and change this formula and make it something else, I can do that, but it's scary from my perspective of doing that, because if you spend any time making changes and extracting, one little change in one spot may actually require 3 or 4 other changes elsewhere in the app for it to understand what that app is, what the definition of it, what is that variable, what is the type of that variable, all that kind of stuff. So going from local and packing it up and pushing it out to prod is something that I've rarely done. I think I've done it once, maybe twice, and only in minor changes. So I recommend primarily this is, hey, you're just pulling it back and being able to do diff and see what was in this version. When was this change made? All that kind of stuff is stuff that you can much more easily get if you've extracted out your app. So if you've got nothing from the seminar, hopefully you realize that using the Canvas App Packager can make your life much, much simpler and much easier going forward. So that's my first suggestion. Use the packager, get it extracted, be able to look at it locally. So second option here, and that's to use buttons as functions. So buttons as functions is kind of a funny idea here, but basically a very common rule that you will find, and if you are a pro dev, you should already know this. If you are aspiring to be a pro dev, you may not know this. If you're a citizen dev, you most likely don't know this. But having formulas that are smaller than your screen height makes apps much, much easier to read because you can see all the logic in one place and you don't have to scroll. It also means that your formulas are more specific to what you're actually working on and aren't this big old gob of goo and not knowing where things are. It makes it hard to find things. So it's just like if you had a book. If you had a book that was 1 chapter long and was 300 pages, you'd have very little to no idea what the book is actually about. And if you're trying to find a certain part of it, you'd have to search the whole book. But if you had a book that had 300 pages and 30 chapters, and each of the chapters was labeled well as well as what it was about, then you can much more easily find where the place in the book you're looking for. And it's the same thing with coding. The smaller the functions, better the names of the functions, the easier it is to go find what you're working on. So smaller functions are more readable, more maintainable, there's less bugs. You can also use it to remove duplicate code. And then a feature I'm going to add as well is to actually utilize a debug flag for showing and hiding these functions. So if I go to my screen back here, collapse these. So I go to an example screen here. Here's a different screen, not related at all to the PowerType app, but just something you may actually have in your environment. This is having a subtotal and applying a discount. So let's say I want to make it 10%, and now the total updates to 900. If I make it 55, you get an error. Hey, you can't have a discount that's greater than 50% or less than 0. So there's a little bit of logic that's evolved around that. So how would you go through and implement this in your actual app? What I've gone through and set up here is I've set each of these on select events to actually, why is that not giving me what I want? On select is false for everything. These things. Oh, on change. All right, there we go. Don't click on select when you want to check on change. So basically, both of these text boxes, I'm calling another button that I label as func validate discount ex button. So that one as well, the on change. So both of them are doing the same exact thing. These buttons are hidden buttons that aren't involved with the UI, but they're functions. So what I also do is I have a debug screen in here where I go through and I have an ability to just check this thing, which then actually calls the on change of this thing and this label and are on the select of it. And here I go through and I build up this little debug context, which is a global variable that I can then set all these debug values to. So this is also very helpful if, let's say you're doing an app where you want to be able to log in as another user where you can't log in at their account, but if on the onload of the app, you set a couple of variables based on the user, and then you use those variables elsewhere, you could override that in a debug screen and set those variables to a separate user that you are looking up via name or email address or whatever functionality you want to do. So that gives you an ability to be able to log into that. And then if you log down this debug screen to only certain users having access to it, maybe by clicking on the version, maybe if you have a version text box somewhere and you click on the version, you check to see if they have a certain role or a certain right. And if they do, then you navigate them to this debug screen. If they don't, it just does nothing. And then you, as an actual admin, can go in and start to play around a little more with the app, even if you're not even in a web experience and a maker experience like this in the actual app itself. You could go through and do that. So this thing has updated this one variable that I'm using in my context here. All right. Now we see these little buttons that show up down here, and these are my function buttons. I've made them really, really ugly on purpose because you're not supposed to see them as part of the main app. So those are the buttons. So what happens here is on the on change of this button gets called from both of these actually on change. This button gets selected, and this is the validation rule in here. So it's going to go through and expand this. So it's going to go through and check to see if the discount is less than or greater than 50 or less than 0. It's going to flip a flag, and then it's going to eventually call this other function here. I'm going to walk through this a little bit later, but it's called this other function. So this one calls this one, which is a validation, and then this one does the actual work of calculating the actual percent discount. So total equals the discount percentage times the actual subtotal to get the actual total. Now, this is an extreme example where I've only got one line in a function. That may be taking it to the extreme. It probably is, but just wanted to give you an example of, if you've got 20 lines of code or 15 lines of code, somewhere in that round, it may make more sense to put it out into a function. So that's my my MVP tip there. One thing to be concerned with or wary of is that you've got to handle delayed execution when you do that. So if you don't know what delayed execution is, I'll try to walk that through here. When a text value is changed, that's going to trigger the onChange event to get called, which then calls your formula. The formula is then going to actually select the validate discount button. Okay? that doesn't actually call the code in the formula right away. What that's going to do is put it into a queue. So there may be other selected calls that are waiting to process on the queue, and now this new validate discount call goes on the queue of things that need to be processed. But before anything gets processed, the rest of the formula in your app is going to, the rest of the formula in control is going to finish processing. So if you had any logic that happened after the validate discount, it's going to process. Now, normally in coding, if you're just a pro dev and you want to refactor out a method, so you've got 100 lines of code, you want to take 20 lines out and put it in a different function call, you do that and you don't worry about having to have that delayed, having that to be executed in a delayed fashion. That function call will get executed and finished and then come back to the calling point. For Canvas app, you don't have the ability to do that. So it's got to go in this queue and the rest of the function is going to finish processing. So generally, if you're going to call it to a function, you either have to ensure that it doesn't have any dependencies on anything that happens after that in the function, or you put it at the very bottom of the function. So that's what we did in this case, is it's at the very bottom of the function. So once that actual on-change event of that subtotal is finished processing, then the items on the queue start processing. So all those other selected calls we process, and then finally now our validate discount call will get processed. And when that happens, it's going to actually trigger that validate discount logic to run. Okay. So this is a method to make life simpler or easier, but you have to also be aware of anything that you may be doing that is going to have a dependency of something else, because you're going to introduce delayed execution in your code. So as much as Canvas apps has brought in the ability for non-dev users to be able to do some awesome and very powerful things, once you start getting into the complex realm of apps, you're going to need to step your game up even more and start understanding how code actually executes. And that's where even posting on the community is helpful as well. Hey, this is working, why isn't this working? Or hey, how should this work? And that kind of fun stuff. So that's my warning. Another thing to be concerned about are that race conditions are possible as well. So that race conditions are involved with those delayed executions, but they're also involved when you're dealing with external connectors. So let's say that you have a function here that selects a control. So that places that call in the queue like we had in the previous example. And then when that call runs, it makes a call out to an external connector. And when that happens, it's going to yield control. And what I mean by that is, normally in this queue, if I go back to this queue here, normally the queue will process completely, whatever that happens to be, and then the next thing will get called. But if this validate discount call actually does something else outside of it, if it makes a call out to an external connector, it will cause an actual issue and it will no longer, won't finish executing before the next item on the queue is processed. So this is a little bit hard to talk about, so let's go through and look at another example here.
Hey, before you go on, you have two questions, or
right,
one
sure.
question and a statement, I guess. First question from Anonymous: are the calls to the queues executed in order, e.g. FI, FO?
Yes, that is a first in, first out order. Yep. So it is, yes, they are.
And Will Dorrington made a statement: it's good to note that Azure DevOps Power Apps build tools has a great unpack solution function as well. He just puts a smiley face. So I think he's just being, I think he's just making a statement.
Okay. All right.
Last question that just came in: is there any published plans by Microsoft to directly integrate VS Code or Visual Studio Code? So I guess that's more on my side.
Yep.
There aren't any direct published plans. There is definitely talks, but there isn't direct published plans yet.
I will add to that, not that I am, even though I have NDA stuff to talk about, if you actually look at how code is structured and the metadata that's structured, it isn't as simple as here's a code file, go to town.
Yes.
There is a lot of metadata that is, you can look in the actual exported app to see, oh, here's where everything is defined. So any tool that reads this is going to have to understand all this other jumbo stuff before it can actually give you a good debugging experience or good actual programming experience. So that's a difficult ask. I know it's a huge thing that I want to personally have, and I will do everything I can to tell Microsoft to do so, but that's a pretty big ask.
It is a very large hurdle to clear. It is certainly something that's been discussed behind the scenes here, but it's not something that we can just simply go click, 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 and it's ready. So good question, though. All right. So I think that's generally the questions that we had.
Okay.
So let's continue.
All right. So going back to the first question we had about items to be processed in a FIFO manner, we have to be worried about that when you deal with calls that are external, because those yield control. So I'm going to have a little app here, a little button here, that all it's doing, it's clearing this first account, and then it's selecting these two buttons, the get account and get name. The get account button is going to refresh my account to make sure that it's always grabbing the latest version and actually hitting the actual database. If it doesn't do that, then it's going to potentially grab from cache, and when it grabs from cache locally, it doesn't yield control. So that's kind of a little caveat here. So I do that to make sure that we are actually hitting the database. And so we are actually going to get the very first account from my accounts collection from CDS. And then the second one we'll process here, and it's going to check to see if it's blank. If it's blank, it's going to give an error. And if it's not blank, it's going to give the actual name and set that to the name. So if I hit my button here and actually try to call this, I'm moving it. There's a moving part. Okay, so I hit it, and you can see this is actually taking a while to select. That's because once that started to operate, the get name called. So the get name called, and it updated the text label here to error. And then finally, the get account finished, but it doesn't update the label. It just updates that variable, and so we are left with error, which is not that great. So how do you get around that issue? Well, let's look at the simpler way it works for now here. I've created a new variable here, first account. It goes and grabs the first account. So in this case, I do any of the work that is involved externally. I go and I call it from, actually I better refresh this too. Refresh. Spell counts, right? So in this case, I do any of the work externally in the first button. So that way, when this call is made, it's going to yield execution to the app. Once the account comes back, then it will continue processing and process these two buttons. And so this button is a little bit different than the original in that it's just getting the actual first account, this actual other variable that we created, and setting it. So it's all local. There isn't an external call. And then it calls this get name. This button calls this get name as well. So now if I run that one, you see now it takes a while for that to go get the count, but then boom, now we have name is CLE Daryl. That's just a little joke there. But anyway, so that's one way to do that. Now this is it works for now because you have to be careful that you never ever put in a external call in either this button or this button, because if you do, it's going to break your app. Potentially, it's going to cause a race condition. So just be careful that you that's kind of a dangerous way to do that. The more, I'm going to break this again so we have error again. The more safer way of doing that is to not call two buttons simultaneously, because then that puts a dependency that ensures that that first button call doesn't have anything that the second button call needs. So with this one, you call this other button, and in this one, it does the work it needs to, and then when it's finished processing, it calls the next one. So in here you're chaining things. You're chaining one call to the next call, which generally isn't all that great. I'd prefer to work the other way, but we don't really have an option in this. And so this is the way to ensure that even if I start adding multiple things in here that are doing external calls, I'm never going to have a case where this button, func get name threading button, that it doesn't actually get called until we've actually done the call to the server and it's populated the data that it requires. So that's threading. Threading's complicated. It's something that, especially if you're on a pro dev, you're going to really struggle with for a long time. But those are just some general rules to abide by. Any questions on that before we move on? All right, I'm going to take silence as a good thing, that I did a good job explaining, not that I completely lost you. So let's hope that's the case. naming things. Naming things is hard. Naming conventions are like way harder than naming things. The good news is that Microsoft does have a fairly decent coding standard guideline. There's the link for it. It's a PDF. It actually even goes down to like the TLA's 3-letter acronym level and gives some examples of how to do that. The biggest caveat, and they call it out there, the biggest caveat is this is not the Bible. This is not, you have to do all these things. No one's going to look at your code base and go, oh, that's wrong. Don't do that. What the point is for you or whoever's in charge to make an educated decision as far as if this is something they agree with. The docs actually, this guideline actually does a fairly good example of saying, why should you do it this way? Which I love, rather than just plainly saying, do this. I was at a company once where they used all of their JavaScript naming conventions and applied them to C#, or maybe it was the other way around, I'm not sure. But that caused me great deals of pain because there's reasons that they are done differently in each language. And to just throw them out the window like that was really affecting my OCD. So this is a good starting place. You can say, all right, day one, let's look at these things. And then very quickly, you need to come up with a reasons why you're going to use that particular set of the naming conventions or not. For example, they always recommend putting screen in the name of the actual screen name. And this is primarily for screen readers. In case someone can't see and they want to be able to look at that, they'd be able to read it off the screen. So maybe that's something that doesn't apply to your work environment. Maybe it's something that you don't have to worry about. And so maybe that's something you don't want to do, but they give the reason why they do it that way. So I tend to find, and I can look at my examples here, that I like having the actual thing first and then the actual Hungarian notation, the actual what it is later. It just seems to be a little more readable. Get button name, threading button. Get function name, function get name, threading button. There we go. That's the name of that one right there. So that tends to make things just a little bit easier for me and when I'm trying to search and find something in the code base. And the IntelliSense, I know it's a function, so func, and then I can get whatever the func values are or func options are, if that makes sense. So, all right, so those naming conventions, highly recommend looking at that. I'll dive into that just in this next screen here as well. So I always recommend to use Camel Case, which starts with a lowercase, then uppers, for anything that's specific to a screen and not global. So anytime you're using context variables, I always have them be lowercase to begin with, and then uppercase for any other words we have in there. That's called Camel Case. And then I use Pascal for anything that's global. Now, why do I switch it that way versus the other? Primarily because collections are global and you can't make them local. So those are automatically global, and those are usually set up to be a capital letter. So I just leave it that way as well. But for some reason you want to switch that around, you can. I also think having a capital letter gives it more importance, like it's more prominent. So that's another reason. So I recommend using Camel Case, which is starting with a lowercase letter, and then uppercase for any new words after that. For context variables, everything else would be Pascal casing, which is the first letter is also capitalized. Indenting. You will find many a times that you decide to either add an if statement or remove an if statement. And although the indenting in the app itself is fairly decent, it isn't perfect, and I tend to do it myself. So for example, if I look at, this is not the one I wanted. I think it's splash screen. Is there a question when I'm searching for this at all? No.
We do have a question that just came in from Philip Topness. Oh, actually,
Oh,
man. What point or conditions would you suggest removing a large chunk of code from a Canvas app and into Azure Function?
Well, obviously, if it becomes unmanageable in your Canvas app, you're going to probably want to try to move that out. But the other issue there is you have to know what kind of app you're working in.
Yeah.
If you're on a field service app, if you're on an app where data connection isn't reliable, you can really, really make a poor experience for the user by starting to move all this functionality out to different functions. So I usually try to do the best I can to start dividing the code base into smaller functions that I can then work with by using those button features on the app. rather than immediately jumping into the flows, just because you don't know if you're going to have a connectivity issue or not. So that's just a be aware. Hey, if you want to run that route, great, go that route, do that. But just be aware of that. And now you're dealing with stuff that's you're also dealing with potentially a little more cost as well. We had an issue this week actually where the current client, they went over their allowance for flows and the Canvas app broke multiple times because of that. So just be aware that that's another layer of another choke point, another layer where you could have a potential issue when you do that. So this is the init timer function that Scott has, and this is what sets up the actual like where things are on the screen and all that kind of fun stuff. It's formatted very well. We got this really weird, ugly blob, which there's really not much you can do with. It's just what it is. And I think he actually generates this from some other app. So he doesn't even edit it. It's just pasted in there. It's just code that's in there. So if you go and you happen to, I'm gonna copy this first. If you happen to remove the formatting and use just the standard text formatting, now your function is really, really long. And this right here is not any more readable than what it was before. And I'd argue that it's actually less readable by a rather large margin, because when I want to actually go down and edit the next thing, I got to go along. Yeah, in this right here, like I don't need to scroll through 40 lines of code to see that we have a loop here. So this is much more readable in that approach. So you will find that, hey, now I need to indent things. I need to indent them differently. That's when you can use a tool like, you can do it in VS Code. It's a little more difficult to key signatures for, but it's also very easy to do that in Notepad++. So if I open up my Notepad++ that I have, once again, free tool, free download, and I decide that, let's say we've got a lot of code here. I don't want to do that all that way. Let's do the simple way here. Do the function here, copy this. All right, so I think that should. All right, cool. So I've got a lot of code here, and let's say I want to indent that. By holding down Alt, you can actually select the lines you want, and you can indent those over however you'd like to, or you can decrease the indent. So that makes it very easy to go through and not have to remove all of your formatting in the actual formula bar and be able to actually start using that. And you can even just copy and paste what's in the formula bar out of the formula bar into this and start working with it. So if I wanted to take Scott's code here and take it in here and decide I want to put this in an if statement, I can select those lines and indent them, and everything works great. So, all right, so that's using Notepad for indenting. Any other questions? Still going good? All right. We will have a little bit more time at the end, so if you have a question, feel free to ask. And also, I want to have a little more time to have anybody else share some tips as well. I've only been really working in Canvas apps for about 3 months here, so you may have 3 times as much experience as I do. So if you have some other things that are very helpful to share, that'd be great as well.
And it looks like we also have Brian Dang on the one of the attendees, and he's certainly plus oneing and adding more information to it. So feel free, you got backup.
All right, thank you, Brian. Him and I communicated, I think, was it Twitter or LinkedIn? Can't remember, but yeah, I enticed him with my screenshot of a complicated formula. So you can do some loops, which I didn't think was possible, but you can actually do loops in Flow. I had an instance in an app where they were wanting to make a call out to an external app. If it failed, they wanted to call it again, and they wanted it again. They wanted to do 3 retries, and so they duplicated the logic 3 times. That's bad. Don't do that, because very easily you could change the logic in one place, not the other 2 places, and now maybe it works in one spot and not the second or third time, and you don't know that, and it's very difficult to test. And yeah, do your best not to have duplicated logic, and you can use loops to do that. It's a little more complicated. I'm not going to show that in here, but you can actually do that with a toggle control, and Eric here has a very good video on that, so I recommend you check that out if you ever need to get in that situation. Here's part I will not budge on. I said the coding standard is not the Bible, but you do need to be religiously zealous in your indenting and formatting approach that you use. If you are the sole creator and maintainer for apps in your environment, guess what? You get to define that. If there are multiple people, you need to include them and come up with a how you're going to format things so you're all being able to read things the same way. That's just a requirement in order to be able to figure out what's going on in the code base. So just know that ahead of time. So here's another interesting one. Don't use avoidable ifs. So an avoidable if is an if that's not necessarily required. So if I look at my validate discount example button. Cool. So I mentioned we were going to go back through here, so now we're going to do that now. I zoom in, does that zoom the text in? A little bit, cool. So in this example, I was checking to see if the discount is greater than 50 or less than 0, and then I was using that just to update this error message to say, hey, it's true or it's false. Because it's a Boolean, I don't need to be writing an if statement. I can just be directly assigning the result of this comparison to the function. So these, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines of code are basically exactly equivalent to this line of code. Only it theoretically runs a little bit. Actually, it doesn't run any faster. It's the same exact thing, basically. Maybe it runs a tiny, an infinitesimal amount you won't ever be able to notice, even if you do it 5 million times faster. Sure. But yeah, so it's just way more readable. This line is versus all of these lines. So next statement here. Use commas for else's on a new line. So if I happen to have this over here, although this is valid and it compiles just fine, it's difficult to notice that comma here. And if you have a lot of lines of code, it's even way more less difficult to notice that comma. So I highly recommend to use a comma on a separate line by itself for the else portion of your if statements. Okay, can't recommend that enough. That makes it way easier to see, oh, here's my if, here's this, here's that. Second thing here, try to avoid nots. So previously when I actually wrote this, I said, hey, if we don't have an error, then select this value. Well, then I also decided, I needed to say, if we do have an error, I need to show not applicable or not available here. So I originally wrote it like this and had these statements swapped. And it's much harder for our brains, as wonderful as they are, to actually read a not than it is not a not. So if discount error, great. Versus if not discount error, then that takes a lot more brain power and juice to be able to go look at something, and much easier to make a mistake in. So try to avoid your nots. If you have an if statement with an if and an else like this, and you have a not in here, switch the order of these things and remove your not. Simple. If you only have an if without an else, hey, your not needs to stay in there. And don't worry about it. It's no way you can change that. So that's questions on ifs and else. Another thing that you need to be worried about is to define how your data for your screen or your app is actually going to be reset. What I mean by this is as you navigate from screen to screen, you need to make sure that you aren't pulling in data from previous app or previous session. So I'll tell you a quick story in this. When I first transitioned over from the CDS world, Dynamics world, directly into the Power Apps Canvas app world, they were having a bug. They're saying, hey, this if statement is not firing, even though it should be firing. And I was looking at the Boolean value they were looking at, and I was saying, hey, where's this value being defined at originally? Where's it being reset at? And they were never actually resetting it. And so what would happen is they'd go through they had a service tech that was in the home. They'd go through the first customer. It would say, hey, this is valid, great. They go to the next customer. They wouldn't reset the app. They just click on the next job to go process. And now they've got stale data from the previous app that's already preloaded when they load the form. So or the screen. So just be very careful that you are defining, hey, in the onVisible, maybe you need to reset all the context variables for your app. In the app load, maybe you need to reset all of the global variables. Maybe you need a refresh button on the main screen to reset all the global variables if you want to be able to pull new data. Those are all things you need to go through and define. So you need to establish that up front before you even start creating and designing your very first screen. And then I believe we've got one more here, or this is the last one, and then we're going to move on to the questions. So if you've got a burning question, then feel free to start typing that up, I guess. So another thing I found very helpful is manually adding a version number text field to the app. And then to also store it in a data store of some sort. So if you're connecting to Azure Database, if you're connecting to CDS, great, store it in one of those spots. And the reason I say to do that is that allows you to then force your users to actually update the app. By default, if I publish a new app, that does not force the user to update the app. If they are in the middle of doing something, that may be a bad thing. If I've just typed up 10 pages worth of notes on a customer and all of a sudden I'm forced to update the app before I can save my data, you're going to have a very angry user or a frustrated user on your side. In this case, though, it's just being able to force them to update that on a certain spot where you want to check for that. That's a great feature to be able to have. Another advantage to that is when you are testing things and you may have a QA person that's working with you, if you're lucky enough to have somebody else helping you in that, it's very nice to be able to say, hey, are you on this version of the app, and to have it showing in the screen. That version number also can use as your debug tool too, if you want. Click on that version number and it takes you to the debug screen. At one point in time, I actually thought of using the Konami code for going through and getting into the debug screen, typing up, down, left, right, whatever from the Contra Nintendo days. I actually thought of doing that, but yeah, I ended up going a little more realistic approach into finding it in the database I was using. But anyway, I digress. Funny story, but that's just another example of why that version number is helpful, because you can't really get the version number of the app, and then just giving year, month, day, and then whatever version of the day you've updated makes it very easy to figure out how old an app is or whatever's going on. So that here's my contact information on Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, and GitHub. Want to check out any of my stuff? If you do send me a message on LinkedIn, a request on LinkedIn, please include a note of, hey, you saw me in this presentation, or hey, you used this, or hey, you saw that. I generally don't accept invites for people that I haven't met before, or I don't know what that connection is. I like to have that connection, so that's just my own request to know why do I know you? How do you know me? And I like having that. So just add a personal note if you need to, and yeah, that's my request for that in LinkedIn. Besides that, feel free to reach out. So questions? Do you have any questions, Pervin?
Nothing new that's come in.
Okay.
Certainly been an engaged audience.
Does anybody have anything they'd like to share about something maybe that I missed that they found useful when dealing with large apps?
Or even some different approach that.
Or somewhere that I'm wrong. That's perfectly acceptable too.
This is all net new to this world, so by no means are we saying that we're the true experts. There's always 5 ways to skin a cat, as I say. Probably a bad choice of terms, but you get what I'm saying.
Just don't let Sarah Kirchley know. That's
I was just thinking that. Yeah, it's morning time here. Well, right. I guess if there are no other questions, there are ways for you to get a hold of Daryl on the screen and certainly ask some questions. Daryl, this has been so much fun. So much fun. Yes. It is rare that I get to delve back into the developer world and peek back into code, so I can certainly say that I had a lot of fun with this. So certainly want to have you back on to talk more about this. I'm sure there's always more things to glean, and I will certainly say that we should have you. Ooh, 2 new questions that came in. I guess people were typing quick. Robert asks, how do you get past the 500 return limit?
500 return limit for what?
He didn't leave much information on that. Maybe he'll type in a subsequent piece of information. Phil Cole has, do you have any tips for offline usage? That's a good question. I
have been lucky enough not to have to deal with that, but we did have an MVP that just recently posted a listen. That was that. I think it was Canadian. Was that? Was that the Serum Croissant? Was he the one that did that one? I think who did that one.
I think what we'll do is we'll get a link together for some of the various offline options. I think the big thing that we pointed out as one of the earlier questions, When you start making an app, you really need to start thinking about how it's going to be used before you get too deep into creating code, because if you do end up with a lot of code bloat in one area and you want to obviously take advantage of Azure, that's where you can certainly run into that challenge of if they're without connectivity, then you won't have that function or that piece of code available.
Yeah. So here's a blog site for that
Yep.
I did see. Canvas apps offline tips and tricks from stuffed and tacos.
And certainly go to the community sites that exist, either on community.dynamics.com or community.powerapps.com. There's a wealth of information around offline, as well as in general questions that people have run into where we've answered them as well, or the community has.
That's a great point there too. If you're struggling with something or wondering how do you do something, that's a great spot to go to get answers as well. So yes.
Yep. Joe, hi Daryl, that was great. Thanks. We'll probably think of a question later, so you'll get besieged by Joe Gill a little later.
Okay. All right. Thanks,
Anonymous, really liked the session. Big thank you. So that's awesome. Phil posted a link about 500 limit. So I'm not going to open up the link yet. Here's a link to what Daryl was talking about from Brian. So he's got a Twitter post that from Oliver Clement. And in regard to collections, there is a limit of 500 records that can be returned.
Ah, okay. Well, the reason
so the link that Phil included does give an option of how to overcome it. Okay. I mean, it kind of depends on how much information and what you want to do with that collection thereafter. I mean, it could be a case where you want to collect as many as there are, and that could be 10,000 records or 100,000 records. You kind of have to gauge on what you want to do with that collection after you've built up multiple collections and then aggregated together.
Totally.
Let's see. He definitely calls out that what we were just talking about, so it could be a performance thing that you might run into as well, collecting that much data. Every control, this from Anonymous, every control needs to have a unique name, and that's a question. Do you have a tip for naming within each screen?
Okay, so if I go back to my app real quick, the general way of naming things, at least I think it was defined in the actual document that I had for Microsoft, lists the Hungarian notation first. It's like LBL version, timer, whatever. What I tend to do in mine is to put that at the end, but you can put it at the front too. So I didn't bother to number some of these things, so shame on me for not giving a good example here. But here's one: total, and then EX is, so I have a 2-letter acronym for the screen. So that's my example, total example text. So that was how I'd read that variable, rather than example total text. Total example text seems to be a little bit easier. Discount example text seems to be a little bit easier of rolling off the tongue. So having that standard of including the screen name in it means that you no longer have to worry about any other screens. It also makes it easier to know what screen that control is on as well. So as much as most programmers, most pro devs have shown Hungarian notation for years, and that's just putting in the actual name of the actual thing in there. So TXT would be the Hungarian notation in that total example. That's something that I actually do find to be helpful in this Canvas app world.
Awesome. There's still more questions. Where can I find the recording? The recording will be posted on community.dynamics.com and the official YouTube channel for Dynamics 365 once it passes captioning as well as accessibility. So there might be a week or two before it shows up there, but we'll certainly let everyone know when it's posted. Jason Kosman also adds in, screen names should be meaningful because they're used for accessibility. Yes, absolutely correct. And Jason, I'm glad that you got your luggage back. William Dorrington, will the recording of this presentation be shared? Thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you. It will be. And I think that runs through all the questions that we've gotten. A lot of good feedback, a lot of good questions. I'm glad everyone saw value in it. We'll certainly bring back Daryl for some more coding fun.
And it sounds like, actually, I got to ask Jason a question there. So the name of the screen, is that what's read to the user when they go to a different screen then?
I believe so.
Oh, okay, all right.
From
So
an
these are bad
accessibility
screen
standpoint,
names
it
then.
should read from the screen name itself as it reads them aloud.
Yeah. So this should be the way that that's actually done then. All right, cool. Learn something new then.
Otherwise,
today. So
yeah, it would go example scoring return.
Yeah. All right. So I was thinking from a creator experience. Well, that isn't all that helpful. But yes, if that is one area where we cross over from the maker to the actual user of it, then yes, that makes a whole lot more sense that you need to have screen rather than skr listed there. So shame on me. I'll update those.
That's good to know. I did not realize that myself initially, and we're all trying to be accessibility compliant.
Thank you, Jason.
I think screen names, Phil does confirm. Screen names are read by screen readers, and there should be real words with spaces.
Cool.
Well, that's awesome. I think we're at the 11 o'clock mark, so we've done an hour, and you can see that that Daryl is saving after putting in some real names for his screens. So we've certainly learned a little bit. We've imparted some knowledge.
Yep.
I think that's always a good thing on a Monday, especially, it's a Monday. With that said, I'm gonna go ahead and put a stamp on this. We'll go ahead and put the recording, do some markups, make sure that it is accessibility compliant, and then we'll post it on the official YouTube channel for Dynamics 365. But it also sounds like we'll probably post this up on the community.powerapps site as well, just since there's a lot of overlap here and a lot of lessons learned that I'm sure that the general Power Apps developers would certainly glean a lot of cool information from, not just Dynamics. So with that said, Daryl, thank you so much. It's been certainly a pleasure. And for everyone that was on the call, thank you for attending live. We will certainly start back up very soon after Thanksgiving. We're going to take off the week of Thanksgiving since everyone should spend some time at home with fam. And so we'll take the week off for Thanksgiving, but then December 2nd, we'll be back with Renato, and he'll be talking about Business Central and Flow, which was changed to Power Automate. But for those of you who want to know how to use Business Central and Power Automate together effectively, Renato will be on and he'll talk more about that.
Thank you, Perfin.
All right, thank you all. Put a stamp on this, we're done.